Hello, this is Dr. Bob Evans, and welcome to our podcast, Parental Alienation from Couch to Courtroom and Beyond. We will discuss the resisting and refusing dynamic, commonly referred to as parental alienation, how you'll know it's happening in your case, and what can be done about it. Parental alienation can cause stress and trauma in high-conflict cases. These podcasts focus on how attorneys and mental health professionals can support families and children. Well, hello, and welcome to episode 33. One of the things that I've been thinking about, and I've thought about this for a very long time, is that the consistency of behavior in favored and alienating parents is so pronounced that I thought there's got to be a playbook out there. There's got to be something out there that these people are following, because there's just such commonality over how they behave across the states. But now it occurs around the world. There's like 60 countries that now recognize parental alienation. And so thinking about the patterns of behavior of a favored or alienating parent, and this is regardless whether this is conscious or unconscious, because it's such a persistent, consistent pattern. So I thought about let's categorize, or let's look at the literature to see what the pattern is. And so the repetitive behavioral pattern has really been documented in research over the years. And the reason is because there seems to be such a limited set of recurring strategies that one can use to create this distance between a child and the other parent, the other caregiver. And of course, probably the most famous person that's identified this in the literature is Richard Gardner, and he called this the parental alienation syndrome. But obviously, it's occurred very many years previous to Richard Gardner. It goes way back to the 1940s, and then even in social science research, we see indications of behaviors that social scientists have identified. And so let's take a look at one of the things that was outlined by Amy Baker and Bill Burnett. Things like bad-mouthing the other parent, denigrating the other parent is a very consistent behavior that we see in alienation cases. The bad-mouthing is done either directly to the child or within earshot of the child. And more frequently, it's directly to the child, indicating something about the other parent that's not acceptable. It's unsavory. Limiting contact is a big one. In other words, if you can isolate the child from the other parent and prevent them from actually experiencing the love and caring of that other parent, and then indoctrinate them in terms of misinformation about the other parent, i.e. the bad-mouthing, then you're going to be more successful in alienating that child from the other parent. There's interfering with communication, and that's where any kind of communication between the child and the rejected or targeted parent is basically tried to diminish it, interfere with it, prevent it from occurring. This way the child doesn't have that experience of the targeted parent. Creating the impression that the other parent is dangerous is a very, very common thing. It's done calling the police for well visits frequently, telling the child that they've been abused by that parent, although they don't remember the abuse because they were so young, or telling the child that the favored parent has been abused through domestic violence. And so in convincing the child that other parent is dangerous. Forcing the child to choose sides is one of the strategies. In other words, presenting the child with situations where they actually choose not to be with the targeted parent. Well, you could go to Johnny's birthday party, or you could go to Johnny's sleepover, or you could go visit the other parent. And the child is then encouraged, in some cases actually forced, to choose not to be with the other parent. Withholding information is a common strategy. In other words, schools, medical information, medical practitioners are not informed about the targeted parent. And so in many cases, we've had cases where children actually been hospitalized, gone through surgeries or whatever, and the other parent had no idea and couldn't get any information because they're not on the accepted list. Schools won't allow that parent to visit the child or have any information about the child because they're not on the contact list. They can't pick the child up after school, etc. Rewriting history is another strategy. In other words, simply making something up in terms of what has occurred in the past and then denigrating the targeted parent in such a way of creating a false history about that parent, creating an idea that they were substance abusers even before they got married, or they never really wanted to have that child. They would just recreate this false history and convincing the child that the other parent is really a bad person. And then very common, recruiting others, friends, relatives, neighbors, professionals, to support the narrative of the favored or alienating parent, so that everybody in the community then basically has this impression of the targeted parent, and then they basically communicate that in some fashion to the child. So the child understands that, gee, there's a whole group of people, including professionals, who don't like the other parent, so therefore the other parent really must be bad. So one of the things that one can do is to look at the psychological categorization, if you will. In other words, from a behavioral science perspective, these tactics fall into certain broad categories of human behavior. And so we can look at this, and this can then start to be used as information you can share with the court, which is important, so that the court gets the idea about the validity of the concept of parental alienation. And that's still a battle that's going on in many, many places. So one of the behavioral perspectives or categories would be a manipulative or coercive control. And we see and hear about coercive control in the domestic violence literature and domestic violence cases and in psychological abuse. And so some of the behaviors that we're talking about, these tactics, fall into this category of manipulative, coercive control. And this is important information for courts to understand. There's the projective identification. In other words, the alienating parent is projecting their own fears and their own anger and their own hostility onto not only the child, but also to the rejected parent. And then they claim that the child's rejection is basically the child's decision. In other words, so they project their own fears and anger onto the child. The child then rejects the other parent, and the favored parent basically sits back and says, it's the child's rejection of that parent. I don't have anything to do with it. There's a category called splitting. This is a defense mechanism where one parent idealizes, in other words, all good parent, and the other parent is devalued or all bad. So there's a splitting defense mechanism, and we call this the lack of ambiguity in Gardner's scheme of things. But there it is, splitting. Next one is called indoctrination or conditioning, and this is repeating the exposure to one side's narrative, i.e. the favored parent's narratives, that basically ultimately shape the child's perception. It's very much like a cult indoctrination process. Another way to look at some of these things is a sociological or legal categorization. And in the legal and forensic psychology literature, this pattern of behavior is classified as, one is family violence, psychological or emotional abuse of the child, and we even actually have diagnostic categories for that. There's also gatekeeping in a real extreme sense. In other words, really restrictive gatekeeping behaviors that become hostile gatekeeping. And then the third category that we would see in the sociological and legal arena would be a pathological alignment, the child's alliance with one parent against the other one, a real breakdown of the whole attachment process. So why do patterns look the same? It's an interesting thought. The consistency arises because the alienation is goal-oriented. And that's where the consistency comes from. In other words, the favored parent wants to erode the child's bond or attachment with the other parent. Essentially, they want to eliminate that parent from the child's life, ultimately. And they're going to do it any way that they can. And these are the behaviors that they use. Commonly, this is what they use across the board. There are only so many effective psychological levers, if you will, to achieve this goal. And so as a result, even unrelated parents in other states and other countries wind up using the same set of behaviors. So it's sort of like what's available for a parent to use to accomplish this goal. This is why experts sometimes compare alienating tactics to controlling partner violence. Different individuals independently use the same method because they work to gain control in family dynamics. So, what do we call this? This pattern, a set of coercive alienating behaviors. So that's what it is. It's a patterned set of coercive alienating behaviors. It's a form of psychological manipulation or coercive control. It's reproducible alienation strategies. In other words, this is a forensic term often used in court. Reproducible alienation strategies. We could do all of this even without saying the word alienation, by the way. A map of common tactics in the form of an exhibit-style chart could be developed for courts so that you would have a tactic, have the psychological mechanism or the category, then you'd have the category of abuse, and then you would have this supporting citation for the court. So this would look like something like we would have columns across the top, and the columns would be labeled alienating tactic. There'd be a psychological mechanism for the next column. The next column would show the category of abuse or control, and then the fourth column would be supporting literature. So you'd have a tactic of bad-mouthing and denigration. The psychological mechanism for that would be splitting, projection of their own hostility onto the targeted parent. The category of abuse or control would be emotional abuse, undermining the child's secure attachment. Notice we haven't even said anything about alienation. And then the supporting literature would be people like Gardner, Amy Baker, Doug Darnell, and Richard Warshak. So another alienating strategy is limiting control. We already mentioned that, right? In other words, setting up scheduling conflicts, refusal of visitation, preventing them from having visitation. Again, notice, no alienation. The psychological mechanism is gatekeeping or coercive control. The category of abuse is called interference with parent-child relationship, custodial interference. And we look to authors in terms of the literature of Johnson and Kelly, Fiedler, Baller, etc. Next tactic, interfering with communication, blocking calls, intercepting letters or texts. The psychological mechanism is conditioning and isolation tactics. The category of abuse is coercive control, psychological abuse, and we looked at authors like Amy Baker and Jennifer Harmon out of Colorado. Next tactic is creating fear, danger, having a narrative of false abuse allegations and exaggerations, creating a fear of the targeted parent. The psychological mechanisms are projective identification, induce phobia in the child. And then as the category of abuse is emotional abuse and coercive control, and we look to people like Fiedler and Bala, Harmon, Kruk and Haynes. Next tactic is forcing the child to choose sides. Here we have a psychological mechanism is the loyalty conflict. It's role reversal. Child is a protector of the favored parent. The child becomes a protector. And this starts to look like an enmeshed relationship. We have the psychological abuse, and it's a coercive loyalty demand, and that's, again, an enmeshed relationship. We looked at people like Johnson and Kelly, Baker, and Fine. Next tactic is withholding information, school, medical, extracurricular information regarding the child. The psychological mechanism is control of access to the child's world. The category of abuse is gatekeeping, parental disenfranchisement. We look to Richard Warshak, Fiedler, and Bala for those resources. Tactic of rewriting family history, erasing positive memories, reframing neutral events as bad. I had a good time at that vacation. We used to go vacations every year, but I really didn't like going. It was terrible. The psychological mechanisms are cognitive distortion, narrative control, it's indoctrination, it's coercive psychological manipulation. We look to Baker, Burnett, Morrison, a number of folks that have this literature. And finally, we look at the recruiting of allies, the extended family, friends, professionals, neighbors to support the favored or alienating parent. The tactic is basically a psychological tactic is triangulation. It's social proof. It's for collective gaslighting, and it's coercive control, coercive coalition building. And we looked at people like Harman and Demos Lorendos. So these categorizations, these are tactics that are not isolated incidents, but part of a coercive control pattern, mirroring behaviors seen in intimate partner violence and cult indoctrination. This is domestic violence. The consistency across cases underscores the reliability and the validity of parental alienation as a recognizable phenomenon, which, by the way, would support a Daubert admissibility. The child's exposure constitutes psychological maltreatment, and that's formally recognized in the ICD-11, the International Code of Disorders, and as caregiver-child relationship problem, psychological abuse, and the DSM-5, we see psychological abuse is confirmed in that documentation. Very robust literature to support what we just talked about. So there are certain things that we could do to help a court understand this. It's the biggest problem, the challenge that we have is that judges and attorneys have very limited psychological training, and initially they may view parental alienation as too abstract, it's controversial, it's subjective. And so what convinces them are frameworks that translate the science into legal language, courtroom logic, and child welfare standards. That's what they'll understand. So briefly, they'll use established legal gateways. One of the tactics would be linked to child abuse frameworks, frame alienating behaviors as psychological child abuse, citing the ICD-11 and DSM-5. Judges are trained to recognize abuse. We look at using an analogize this whole phenomenon to coercive control, domestic violence. They'll recognize that. We'll show how the alienating parents' tactics mirror patterns already accepted in family court, coercive control laws, interpersonal violence precedents, etc. And then we look at highlighting Daubert and Frye admissibility. That doesn't seem to come up a whole lot in many of the cases that I've worked in. Occasionally, but it's not as frequent as I would expect. So we look at present peer-reviewed research demonstrating the reliability, the validity, and the general acceptance. And we talk about the behaviors, the tactics. That's what they'll understand. Also, in terms of convincing the court, is basically create a visual playbook, a chart where judges grasp patterns better visually. So use plain legal language instead of projective identification. Just say the favored parent puts their fears into the child, who then believes that the other parent is unsafe. They'll understand that. They won't understand projective identification. Tie it back to the child's best interests, which, again, the court is mandated to really be concerned with. We talk about drawing parallels to familiar concepts. For example, compare alienation to witness tampering. Just as tampering contaminates testimony, alienating behaviors, these tactics, contaminate the child's ability to express authentic feelings. How many times do you see in cases where courts appoint an attorney for the alienated child? That attorney has to understand that they're not getting the child's actual position. The child is actually expressing something that has been conditioned into them. We have to compare this to brainwashing, cult tactics, repetition, isolation, fear, and loyalty demands. That's exactly what's going on in these cases. We have to compare to false confessions. Children can internalize a narrative that just isn't theirs, is not accurate, may have never even occurred, totally false. How about using case law? Each state has got cases that have recognized, mostly appellate cases, have recognized alienation. Again, citing the behaviors that are in those cases, maybe even avoiding the label of alienation. Educating through Q&A. Basically, we talk about preparing course cross-examination questions that illustrate the pattern with the favored or alienating parent. Did you tell your child that their father doesn't love them? Did you block phone calls? Those types of cross-examining questions. Basically, what we want to show is that the harm to the child, there's emotional harm. The child experiences anxiety, depression, PTSD-like symptoms. I can't tell you how many times you see people diagnosed with PTSD, and if you look at what it takes to get a PTSD diagnosis, it's a lot more than what you see in many of these cases. There's developmental harm. There's this distorted identity that the child has. There's an impaired attachment capacity that the child has, which is really significant. And you see this in very young children, which is even more damaging than it is in older children, but it's just as damaging in older children. There's long-term outcomes, higher risk of substance abuse, relationship problems. We can make a link to adverse childhood experiences. So it's really important to communicate this, the significance of these behaviors and how it's affecting the child. So we've kind of gone on quite a bit, so I wanted to share this little bit of recognition and an observation of the patterns that we see in these alienation cases. I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for joining us today. For more information on this topic, please visit www.drbobevans.com or www.naopas.com. We offer classes for both legal and mental health professionals to help educate them on the signs and strategies of parental alienation and how to move forward for a healthier environment for the children of divorce. Please visit www.naopas.com and sign up for our courses and use coupon code PODCAST for a 50% discount.